Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics 111. We're now going to talk about one of the three tools of monetary policy. The other two tools are open market operations, when the Federal Reserve buys or sells bonds to the public in an attempt to change the supply of money, which will change the cost of money, which is interest rates. Another tool is the discount rate, a penalty that banks have to pay when they do not meet their required reserves. This tool is going to be the reserve requirement, which will enable us to calculate something called the money multiplier. The Federal Reserve sets the reserve requirements, the percentages of the bank's deposits that must be held in the bank and not loaned out. Banks may not loan out these required reserves. This is a fractional reserve system. In other words, part of a customer's deposit can be kept on deposit, but the other part can be loaned out, which will be loaned out by other successive banks, creating a larger increase in the money supply than the original loan. The amount of reserves a bank holds is known as total reserves. The total reserves are composed of required reserves and excess reserves. Required reserves are deposits which the bank has to keep on deposit. And excess reserves are the amount the bank can loan out to other customers, which banks want to do as much as possible since they can make profits doing that. These reserves held by the bank beyond those required reserves are called excess reserves. How much money would be created if the bank loaned out its excess reserves to the last penny? To find out, we have to calculate the money multiplier. The money multiplier determines how much money can be created from an initial deposit, which is then loaned out. Then that loan is spent through a check, and that check is deposited in another bank. That bank's reserves go up. That bank makes more loans, and this happens repetitively, creating a large increase in the money supply. The money multiplier can be found by taking 1 divided by the reserve requirement. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, 1 divided by 0.1, 10%, would give us a money multiplier of 10. So an initial deposit of $100 would create $1,000 of new money, M1 checkable deposits. When loans are made, checkable deposits increase. So to do this, you're going to find the expansion of the money supply, which is what we're seeking. You take the money multiplier and multiply it by excess reserves, assuming that all excess reserves are loaned out. An important assumption. Banks have to be fully loaned out for this to be as effective as possible. If the money multiplier is 10 and a customer deposits $900, $9,000 can be created through loans, and if the original $1,000 was new money as a result of the customer selling a bond to the Federal Reserve gave the customer $1,000, then you would add the $1,000 to the $9,000 for a total increase in the money supply of $10,000. Money held by the federal government doesn't count as money. It is not in circulation and not available to affect GDP. But if the Federal Reserve buys a bond from an investor, the Federal Reserve receives the bond and the investor receives the $1,000. Now the money supply just went up by $1,000 since the public now holds the $1,000. Adding that to the amount of loans that can be created by an increase in checkable deposits of 1,000 will create a total increase in the money supply of $10,000. Assume a customer deposits $1,000 in the bank, and we're going to assume that $1,000 came as a result of the customer selling his bond to the federal government. If he receives $1,000 in a check, checks are countable as M1, and so the money supply goes up by $1,000 for each of these scenarios. So, if required reserves are 1% and a customer deposits $1,000, 10 of that $1,000 has to be kept on deposit, and excess reserves are 990. The money multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio. 1 over 0.1 is 100. 990 excess reserves times the money multiplier of 100 would cause an increase in the money supply as a result of loans of 99,000. We have to add the original $1,000 in, and you have an increase in the money supply of $100,000. Money multiplier of 100 times 1,000, $100,000. Or you can break it into pieces. The amount of money created through loans, 990 excess reserves times the money multiplier of 100 is 99,000, and add this change in the money supply of 1,000 to get 100,000. If the reserve ratio were 5%, then $50 of the original $1,000 deposit has to be kept in the bank, and $950 is excess reserves that can be loaned out. The money multiplier is 1 divided by 0.05, which is 20. 950 times 20 would result in $19,000 of additional loans being created, and an additional 1,000 would be 20,000. 20 times 1,000. $20,000. Total increase in the money supply from the original deposit plus loans. If the reserve ratio were 10%, then $100, 10% of 1,000 would have to be kept in the bank and $900 to be loaned out. The money multiplier is 1 over 0.1, which is 10. $900 in excess reserves times the money multiplier of 10, $9,000, plus the original 1,000 as a result of the government buying the bond from the public, $10,000. 12.5%, 125, 875 excess, 1 divided by 12.5 is 8. 8 times 875 is 7,000. 1,007 is 8. Alright, and here's the number 415. If required reserve ratio was 0, the money expansion would be infinite. Why would this be bad? If you remember the equation of exchange, MV equals PQ. If the velocity of money, how many times a dollar changes hands in an accounting period, is constant, and this were infinite, then only GDP would grow only by a little, and the rest of that would bleed into inflation, P. If the reserve ratio wants to increase the money supply, should it raise or lower the reserve ratio requirement? If the Federal Reserve wants to change the money supply using this one of the 3 tools of monetary policy, they should lower the reserve ratio. Note, as the reserve ratio declines, the increase in the money supply is growing. So lowering the reserve ratio is expansionary. Raising the reserve ratio is contractionary. If the Federal Reserve increases the reserve requirement, the velocity remains the same, what will happen to nominal GDP? Well, if they increase the reserve ratio, then the amount of money that can be created will fall. And so that would be contractionary. Nominal GDP might fall because there's less money being created. That would be meant to be fighting inflation. What economic goal might the Federal Reserve try to meet by reducing the money supply? Inflation. Why might the money supply not expand by as much? In order for this to happen, the maximum expansion in the money supply, banks have to be fully loaned out. If they don't loan out all $990, $950, $900, they don't fully loan out their excess reserves, they won't get the maximum impact in the money supply. We're going to discuss a couple things that we've discussed before in order to do our next handout, how open market operations work. In order to understand how open market operations work, we have to know about the supply and demand for money. The demand for money is a transaction demand for money, how much money you need to walk around and buy things with. It is determined by gross domestic product, nominal, not real. The higher the rate of inflation, this curve shifts to the right. You'll need more transaction demand for money. Your asset demand for money, or the demand for money you have for savings, is a negative relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money you want to hold in a bank as M2, for example. So the higher the interest rate, you'll take your money out of the bank where it counts as M2 and invest it in the stock market where you'll get an even higher rate of return. You add these two together and you get the total demand for money. By changing interest rates, the Federal Reserve can change how much money you want to hold as an asset, for example. So we're combining the transaction demand for money, the total demand for money, and the supply of money. The Federal Reserve supplies money independently of changes in interest rates because the Federal Reserve is not interested in making a profit or loss. They're interested in changing the supply of money in order to promote the 3 economic goals of growth of GDP, low inflation, and low unemployment. We'll have a particular interest rate that results as the supply of money. If the Federal Reserve wants to fight a recession, the Federal Reserve will want to increase the supply of money. That will cause interest rates to fall and cause consumers to buy more durable goods and business to buy more capital goods, inventory, and construction. How can the Federal Reserve increase the supply of money? The Federal Reserve could buy bonds from the investing public. I like to make a pictogram out of it. Here's the Federal Reserve and here's the public. The Federal Reserve wants money to go this way because money held by the government does not count as M1, but money held by the public does count. In exchange, the public will send the government bonds. So the Federal Reserve is buying bonds and they're giving the public money in exchange for those bonds, which increases the supply of money and drives interest rates down. Then durable good orders go up from consumers, and IG spends more on capital goods, changes in inventory, and construction, both residential and commercial. If, though, the economic problem is inflation, the government will want to reduce the money supply. That will cause the prevailing interest rate to rise. So how can the Federal Reserve cause the quantity of money to fall? The Federal Reserve can sell bonds to the public. Again, I like to use a pictogram. The Federal Reserve wants money to come this way, because money held by the Federal Reserve is not available by GDP. So you will cool off GDP growth or decline GDP, and that will cause us to move lower into the intermediate range of the aggregate supply curve, which would cause less inflation. So that means bonds have to be going the other way. So in this example, the Federal Reserve is selling bonds to the public and getting money from the public. That would cause interest rates to rise because the supply of money has fallen, and the cost of money would then go up. The cost of money is interest rates, and that would cause consumers to buy less durable goods, which are interest rate sensitive because they are long-lasting, generally expensive things, and spending on business spending to fall. See on capital goods, changes in inventory, and construction. This is some preliminary information we need to know to do a worksheet that summarizes the three tools of monetary policy: open market operations, the reserve ratio, and the discount rate. The discount rate we will briefly mention before. We'll define it more fully in the next handout.